Pontus Holmberg, if you recall, played all 7 games against Boston last spring, and I thought he was exceptional. Remember, he was getting under the collar of Brad Marchand a bit, like giving a bit of a dose of his own medicine. It's continued into the preseason. One game, you got to preface that, but he was like a perfect example of a guy who is understanding what he needs to do to crack this team and make this roster. At 7 penalty minutes, was held accountable for, ironically enough, an altercation, sort of a hit on Ridley Gregg. We all know that situation from last year. We did a hit in the game, 2 shots on goal. I thought Holmberg really stood out for me too.
Yeah, it's funny because there's some competition coming in. I mean, Easton Cowan, we'll see where he goes, but him not standing out incredibly strong, him not being put on lines that he would probably be aching to have more success, him not being on kind of that heavy roster in the groupings in camp. You're starting to think maybe they're leaning towards him not being ready. And I kind of had him pegged to do so, and it kind of shuffled guys back. But now I think that there's an opening for a lot of different players, Holmberg being one of them, to step in and play. And I agree with you. He gets in a scrap the other day. He's kind of banging. He's getting in guys' faces. He kind of gives a little whatever that was to Greg, just kind of little bit of an FU there. And with Craig Berube, they're looking for that kind of stuff. And it's not just Craig Berube. I talk to coaches all across every league, junior, pro, semi-pro, NHL level. They all are looking for a guy that plays with an edge, that has that chip on their shoulder, that says, I'm going to get in your face, I'm going to rile you up, I'm going to try to play that game within the game. And most of them say they cannot find players willing to do it. They used to be in spades, those Brad Marchand type players. It's no longer easy to find those guys. These kids just aren't as willing to play it. They didn't grow up with it, and they're not really understanding how to play it, or they don't see the value benefit. But enter, Pontus Holmberg. He is playing that way. He understands that. And, there's also, I don't care if you're from Stockholm, Sweden, or you're from Flin Flon, Manitoba. I think he says, I can play that way. I can play with a chip on my shoulder. I can bank crash. I can shed my mitts if I need to. I can stand up for myself or teammates. And I mean, at this point in time, when you're fighting for spots, that kind of stuff is worth its weight in gold, especially when they're trying to change the identity of this team. And Craig Berube at the helm, I think he's only doing himself a service and putting himself up there in the conversation of maybe being, the guy that starts opening night on this roster. And there's a couple other guys that'll have something to say about that. But again, he's doing the things that I think he needs to stand out in that way.
The other thing he has going for him is the fact that he can play wing, he can play center, and his defensive responsibility. I think if you compare him to like a Nick Robertson, obviously a different type of player, very one-track minded. Can you rely on Robertson defensively? I think the jury is still out on that. Where you look at Holmberg, he's been put in positions before. He's got 91 games of NHL experience, 7 more in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I think if you're asking me who's more reliable, it's obviously Holmberg right now. And furthering to that question, like I think if you look at David Kampf, what he brings to the table, I honestly think like Pontus Holmberg is like a poor man's David Kampf. And it's because I think Kampf maybe makes a bit more than he should at 2.4 mil as opposed to like a Holmberg. And I think that maybe in turn lies the bigger question with this roster right now. But I liked what I saw from Holmberg last year. That's continued here. And I think if he continues to play that way, I think he's going to make this team.
Yeah, potentially. You mentioned David Kampf. I mean, he's always kind of just been that quiet fourth line center who's very dependable. He's not on the highlight reel for blow up turnovers and mistakes in the D zone and coughing the puck up and it ends up in the back of the net. He's pretty responsible. He can handle himself out there. Is he wowing anyone with, flashy pizzazz and putting up crazy points? No. Is he super heavy, banging and crashing, being that fourth line, agitator, energy guy? No, he's not really that either. Would it be nice if he was making $1 million as opposed to 2.3 or whatever it is? Yeah, it sure would. But they got to get under the cap here before opening night. And I'm not sure how they're going to do it. There's a few different ways they could go. But if they do decide that, I don't know, I'm scared to lose that reliability of David Kampf on that fourth line. You could send him away and on waivers. I don't think anyone's going to pick him up with that fat of a contract. And all of a sudden you just alleviate a lot of stress in your cap. If they do that or not, I'm not sure. And, Bobby McMahon, Nick Robertson, you mentioned that too. Those guys are fighting for spots too. Bobby McMahon, they have like identical stat lines, something like 56 games, similar point levels, Robertson and McMahon. And I got to say, as far as being one-dimensional or having other facets to your game. That Alberta boy McMahon is capable of having that extra edge and kind of playing, that style with some intensity too, where you mentioned Nick Robertson's kind of a one-dimensional player. He scores goals, he makes plays, but he hasn't been able to prove it consistently enough to warrant a full-time, here's the second line, third line spot. And I think that's holding him back. And yeah, it's going to be a battle, man. I thought that this would be a little bit more cut and dry, but as we come down the stretch of camp here, there's guys battling for some spots.
Make sure to check out more of our content right here on the Leafs Nation YouTube page. We got long form interviews, we got clips, we got epic rants by Jay Rosehill. We simply have it all. And don't forget, you can find out much more at theleafsnation.com. Thanks so much for watching.